I'm going to preface this by saying I know exactly how this makes me look. I've sat with that for a long time now, and I've made my peace with it. I'm not a good person. I wasn't back then, and I can't sit here and pretend I've done a complete 180 since. What I can say is that the things I'm about to tell you genuinely changed something in me, and not because I had some big moral awakening, more because I got a really clear look at what the world looks like when it decides to push back. So take this for what it is. A story from someone who was on the wrong side of things, told as honestly as I can tell it. This was about 8 years ago. I was in my late 20s, and I had been doing something that I'm going to describe as carefully as I can, without getting into specifics that could come back on me. The short version is that I had figured out a way to take advantage of people who were distracted. Not physically, nothing like that. More psychological. I would find people in situations where they were overwhelmed or flustered, and I would create just enough confusion to walk away with something that wasn't mine. I had been doing this for a couple of years at that point, and I had gotten pretty good at it. Good enough that I had stopped feeling any kind of way about it. It was just what I did. It had become as routine as anything else in my life. I would wake up, go through my day, and somewhere in there I would do this thing that I had fully convinced myself wasn't really hurting anyone in any serious way. That's the lie you tell yourself when you've been doing something long enough. You stop seeing the people involved as people, and you start seeing them as just variables in a situation you're managing. Part of what made it work was that I was good at reading people. I could look at someone for 30 seconds and have a pretty solid sense of how they were going to react to things, whether they were the type to push back or the type to freeze up, whether they were going to make noise or stay quiet. I prided myself on that. I thought it was a skill, and in a technical sense it was. It just wasn't one I was using for anything that made my life or anyone else's life any better. I think about that a lot now. How much energy I put into something that was ultimately just about taking from people who hadn't done anything to deserve it. The night I'm about to tell you about, I had gone to this strip mall on the edge of town. Not the kind of place with a lot of foot traffic at night. A few stores, a chain restaurant on the end, a laundromat that stayed open late. The kind of strip mall that feels a little run down and a little forgotten. Half the parking lot lights were out. The pavement had cracks running through it that nobody had bothered to fix. I had scouted it a few times during the day, and I had a plan. Nothing too complicated. I just needed to wait for the right moment and the right person. I got there around 9 at night and parked on the far end of the lot where the lighting was bad. That was always my preference. Bad lighting meant I could observe without being as easily observed. I sat in my car for a while just watching. The restaurant was getting a little busy for a Tuesday, which I hadn't expected. A few more cars than usual coming in and out. That was going to make things more complicated, so I decided to just sit and wait for things to thin out a little. I had nowhere to be. Patience was one thing I actually had in abundance back then. When you do what I was doing, you learn pretty quickly that rushing is how you get caught. So I sat and I watched and I waited. While I was sitting there, I noticed something. A woman was walking to her car alone on the opposite end of the lot. She had a couple of bags from the grocery store on the end of the strip, and she was moving fast like she was in a hurry. The kind of hurry that people with a lot going on have. She had her keys out already, the way women often do when they're walking through a parking lot alone at night. I noticed that too. The awareness she was carrying. I watched her get to her car and start loading things into the trunk. Nothing about this was part of my plan, but something made me keep watching her. Maybe it was just habit at that point. Always observing, always cataloging. That's what years of doing what I was doing will do to you. You become a person who just automatically monitors whatever is happening around you at all times. Then I noticed something else. There was a man in a dark jacket sitting in a pickup truck about 4 spots away from her. He had been there when I pulled in, and I hadn't thought anything of it initially. People sit in their cars in parking lots all the time. But now I was watching him watch her, and the way he was watching her was not casual. He wasn't glancing over the way you might if there was movement nearby and it caught your eye. He was locked in, completely still, completely focused. I saw him shift in his seat when she opened her trunk. I saw him put his hand on his door handle, and I sat there in my car, and I recognized exactly what I was looking at because I had been that person before. Not in exactly the same way, but close enough that I knew what the posture meant. I knew what that stillness meant. I knew what the hand on the door handle meant. I want to be very clear about what happened next because I think about it a lot. I did not do what I did next because I'm a good person. I genuinely don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe watching someone do a version of what I did from the outside made something click in a way it hadn't before. Maybe I just didn't want to sit there and watch something bad happen 300 feet away from me. But I started my car and I pulled forward and I swung around and parked directly behind her car. I didn't get out right away. I just sat there with my headlights on, pointed at her trunk. She looked up at my car for a second, confused, a little startled maybe. I gave her a little wave like I was just some random person waiting for her spot. The guy in the pickup truck sat there for another minute or two and then pulled out of the lot and left. He didn't peel out or drive fast. He just left calmly, like he had somewhere else to be. That calmness was the part that stuck with me, because I knew what that calmness was. It was the calmness of someone who was just going to go find a different opportunity somewhere else. I sat there until she finished loading, got in her car, and drove away. She never knew I was there for any reason other than wanting her parking spot. I went home that night without doing what I had gone there to do. I told myself it was because the timing had been off. Too many people around, too complicated. But I think part of me knew that wasn't really it. Something had shifted in me in those few minutes in that parking lot, and I wasn't totally ready to look at what that shift was. Here's where this story takes a turn though, because about 3 weeks later, something happened that made me realize the night at that strip mall was not the isolated event I thought it was. I had gone back to a routine that I had been running for a while at this point. I won't get into the details of it. What matters is that it involved me spending time in a neighborhood I had no real reason to be in, at hours when most people weren't around. I knew the neighborhood well at that point. I had spent a lot of time learning it. I knew which houses had dogs and what time those dogs would start barking. I knew which ones had motion sensor lights and how sensitive they were. I knew which ones had people who kept odd hours and which ones went dark by 9 every night. I had put a lot of time into learning it, and I had gotten comfortable there in a way that you really shouldn't get comfortable somewhere you have no business being. That comfort was its own kind of warning sign that I completely ignored. One night I was in that neighborhood and I noticed a car I didn't recognize. Dark blue, older model, parked on a street where I knew basically every regular car that belonged there. When you spend enough time in a place, you start to know the cars the same way you'd know the faces. This one was new. I walked past it and glanced in, and it was empty. I kept moving and told myself it was nothing. Somebody visiting somebody. Completely normal. But it was there the next night too. Same spot, same empty car. I walked past it again, and this time I stopped and looked a little closer. There was a coffee cup in the cup holder that looked fresh, still had condensation on the outside, and there was a small notebook on the passenger seat. Nothing crazy individually, but together, in that spot, at that hour, it added up to something I didn't totally love. The coffee cup being fresh meant someone had been in that car recently. The notebook meant someone was writing things down. I went home that night, and I thought about it more than I wanted to. I went back the following night, and the car was gone. I almost relaxed. Then I found it 2 streets over. I only found it because I had started actively looking, taking different routes than usual, covering more ground. And this time when I walked past it, I didn't look in right away. I kept walking, and then I doubled back from the other direction, coming around the far end of the street from a different angle. And as I came around the corner, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. They hadn't been there 30 seconds ago when I walked past, or they had been there and I just hadn't seen them because they were sitting low. Either way, there was a person in that car now, and they were looking straight ahead, not at me, straight ahead. But there was something about the stillness of it that felt very deliberate, like someone who was working very hard at looking like they weren't paying attention to anything in particular. I know that specific kind of stillness because I had used it myself plenty of times. It's not the stillness of someone relaxed. It's the stillness of someone focused. I changed my route and went home. I was not panicked at that point. more unsettled than anything. A little annoyed, if I'm being honest. I had been doing what I was doing in that neighborhood long enough that I had developed this completely irrational sense of ownership over it. Like it was my territory, and this car was an intrusion. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but that's genuinely where my head was at the time. A few nights later, I was out there again, and I found the car on yet another street. Same general area, just a different spot each time, like it was slowly rotating around. And this time, as I walked past, someone got out. It was a man, average height, nothing that stood out about him physically. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he had his hands in his pockets. He didn't look at me when he got out. He just walked around the front of the car and stepped up onto the sidewalk and started walking in the same direction I was walking, about 15 feet behind me, at a pace that matched mine almost exactly. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. Something about the timing of it, the way he had gotten out of that car at the exact moment I was passing, made everything in me go on high alert. I sped up slightly and turned at the next corner. I heard his footsteps turn with me. I crossed to the other side of the street. His footsteps crossed the street. I stopped at a corner and crouched down to tie my shoe, even though my laces didn't need tying. His footsteps stopped, not right behind me, a comfortable distance back, close enough to keep me in sight, far enough that if I turned around and confronted him, he could just say he was walking and there was nothing wrong with that. I stood back up, and I turned around and I looked directly at him. He looked right back at me, just a regular guy, standing on a sidewalk, looking at me with no particular expression on his face. Then he looked down at his phone, slowly, like he was checking something, and he just stood there like he was waiting for a message to come through. I turned and kept walking, and when I got to the next corner, I cut through a yard and came out on a parallel street and started moving fast. I didn't hear footsteps behind me anymore. I got back to where I had parked my car, got in, and drove home. I checked my mirrors the whole way. Nobody followed me that I could see. That was the last time I went back to that neighborhood. I told myself a lot of different things over the next few days to explain it away. Coincidence, paranoia. Maybe I was just losing my nerve after years of doing this. But the honest answer was simpler than any of that. I had been so used to being the one who did the watching that I genuinely didn't know how to handle being watched. And whoever was in that car had clearly been doing it for a while. They had been patient and methodical and completely unreadable. The same things I prided myself on being. And running into a mirror image of that from the other side of it was one of the most disorienting things I have ever experienced. I spent the next couple of weeks in a state I'm not used to being in, jumping at things that wouldn't normally register. A car parked near mine that I didn't recognize. Someone walking in the same direction as me for more than a block. I had always thought of myself as someone who didn't rattle easily, and I found out pretty quickly that I had only believed that because I had never been on the receiving end of what I was putting out. Getting a taste of that was not a comfortable experience. It was clarifying in a way I didn't ask for and wasn't ready for. I never found out who that person was. I never found out if they were connected to anything specific or if the whole thing was some massive coincidence that my guilty conscience had turned into something it wasn't. What I do know is that I stopped going to that neighborhood and I scaled back everything I had been doing in general. Not because I had some moment of moral clarity, mostly because I realized I had gotten careless and comfortable in a way that was going to catch up with me. And I didn't like how it felt to be the one being tracked. I didn't like it at all. But that night at the strip mall has stayed with me longer than the rest of it. Not the guy following me, not the car, that woman loading her trunk, the fact that I sat there in the dark watching her the same way that other man had been watching her, and for a few seconds I had been no different from him. That's the part I can't fully put down, and I've tried. The second story I want to tell is one I've only told once before, to a friend of mine who I trust and who already knew enough about the kind of person I was back then that this didn't particularly shock her. She told me I should talk about it at some point because things like this have a way of sitting in you and getting heavier the longer you carry them around. So, here it is. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I was going through a stretch of my life where I had developed what I can only describe as a compulsion. It had built up gradually the way a lot of bad habits do. So slowly that by the time it was a real problem, it had already been going on long enough to feel normal. I had started going into places I wasn't supposed to be. Not breaking in with force or anything dramatic like that. More like taking advantage of situations where the opportunity presented itself. A door that hadn't been fully pulled shut. A window that someone had left cracked. A garage that was always left unlocked because the people who lived there had gotten too comfortable. I know exactly what this sounds like. I'm not going to pretend it sounds like anything other than what it is. It started pretty small. A neighbor's garage that I had noticed over a period of weeks was never locked. I went in there one evening when I knew they were out. I didn't take anything. I just stood in there for a few minutes looking at the stuff people keep in garages, the lawn equipment and the old boxes and the bikes that nobody has ridden in years, and then I left. There was something about it that I found weirdly satisfying, and at the time I couldn't have told you exactly why. Looking back, I think it was just about being somewhere I wasn't supposed to be and getting away with it. The control of deciding that the rules applied to everyone else but not to me in that moment. It escalated from there the way those things tend to. I started paying more attention to my surroundings in a specific way. Which apartments in my building had residents who traveled for work? Which houses on certain streets had predictable schedules? I got good at noticing patterns without appearing to notice anything at all, which if you've been following this story, you'll recognize as a recurring theme in the way I operated. I started going into places when I knew they were empty, and I would just look around, walk through someone's living room, stand in their kitchen, look at the photos on their walls. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone because I never took anything of real value. I told myself it was basically harmless. I had a whole architecture of justifications built up around it, and I lived inside that architecture very comfortably for a long time. Then things started getting strange. And I want to say again before I get into this that I'm not telling you this as someone who was blindsided by the universe for no reason. I know exactly what set this in motion. But even knowing that, what happened was not something I was prepared for. I came home one evening from work and my apartment felt different. I can't be more specific than that because it wasn't anything I could point to. Nothing was visibly out of place. Nothing had obviously been touched. It was more like a feeling in the air. A wrongness that I couldn't source. I walked through every room checking things, and everything looked fine. I stood in the middle of my living room for a minute just trying to figure out what was bothering me, and I couldn't. I told myself I was being paranoid and I moved on with my evening. 2 nights later, I came home and my kitchen chair was pulled out from the table. I am someone who always pushes chairs in. It's one of those habits that's so ingrained I do it automatically, without thinking about it. Every single time. My mom was particular about it when I was growing up, and it stuck with me in that way that childhood habits do. That chair being pulled out was not something I would ever do and not notice. I stood there looking at it for a long time before I pushed it back in. I checked my door, my windows, everything, all locked, all looked normal. I told myself maybe I had been distracted that morning and just hadn't noticed. I almost convinced myself. About a week after that, I came home and there was a smell in my apartment that was slightly off. Not bad, not strong, just a smell that wasn't usually there. The faintest trace of something, like a different soap or a different kind of laundry detergent. I went through every room slowly. Nothing looked touched, but the smell was there, and it was not mine. I stopped leaving any windows open after that. I started double-checking the door every time I left and every time I came back. I told myself it was just being thorough, but I think some part of me already understood what was happening. Some part of me had connected the dots and was just waiting for the rest of me to catch up. What made it impossible to deny anymore happened on a Thursday night. I had been out with a friend and got home around 11. Nothing out of the ordinary about the evening. I came in, put my keys on the hook by the door the way I always do, went to the kitchen to get some water, and on my kitchen counter, sitting in the middle of it, right where I would see it immediately, was a small yellow sticky note. It said 4 words. I know you've been in my home. No name, no signature, no threat. Just that sentence, in small, careful, neat handwriting. I stood there in my kitchen holding that note, and I didn't move for what felt like a very long time. My brain kept cycling through explanations that weren't the obvious one, and kept hitting dead ends. Someone had been in my apartment. and they had done it deliberately and calmly enough to leave a note. Not to ransack the place or take anything, just to leave a note. The same way I had been going into places and not taking anything, just being there. I called my friend and asked her to come over. When she got there, I told her everything, the whole year of it, every place I had been, everything I had done. She was quiet for a while when I finished. Then she said, "Someone is doing to you exactly what you've been doing to them." She was right. And hearing someone say it out loud when I already knew it was somehow worse than just knowing it privately, it made it completely real in a way I couldn't walk back from. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept running through every place I had been over the past year, every house and apartment and garage, trying to figure out who it could have been. But I had been in a lot of places. There was no way to narrow it down. And that was the part that kept getting under my skin. Whoever this was had been patient about it. They hadn't rushed to do anything. They had taken their time, figured out exactly what they were dealing with, and then made their move in the most deliberate, composed way I could imagine. Not angry, not dramatic, just a note. Just 4 words that said, "I see you and I know what you've been doing." I got a new deadbolt installed the next morning. Better mechanism, harder to work around. I had the building manager change my locks, telling him I thought someone might have a copy of my key. I put a chain on my bedroom door. I did everything I could think of to make my apartment more secure, and then I sat in it and waited to see what would happen next. Nothing happened for almost 2 weeks. I started to let myself breathe a little. Maybe the note had been the whole point. A message sent and received. Maybe whoever it was had said what they wanted to say and was done. Then I came home one evening and there was another sticky note on the counter. Same handwriting. Same small, neat, careful letters. It said, "I accepted your apology." I had not apologized to anyone. I had not reached out, not tried to find out who it was, not done anything except change my locks and stay quiet. I had not apologized. I stood there staring at that note for longer than I'd like to admit, trying to figure out what it meant, whether it was sarcastic or genuine, whether it was a signal that it was over or a signal that something else was starting, whether the person who wrote it was stable or unstable, whether I should be scared or relieved or something else entirely. I still don't know the answer to any of those questions. That note is the part of this whole thing that I have never been able to fully process, because it doesn't fit into any pattern I can make sense of. Nothing happened after that. No more notes, no more smells, no more chairs pulled out. Whoever it was, they stopped. And I stopped too. Truly stopped this time, not just scaled back. Stopped entirely. If you're waiting for me to tell you that I became a different person because of those 2 sticky notes, I'm not going to tell you that. What I will tell you is that standing in my own kitchen holding a note that said someone had been in my home, feeling the specific kind of sick dread that comes with that, made something land in a way it hadn't before. All those times I had stood in someone else's space and thought about how they would feel if they knew I was there, I had always kept that thought at a comfortable distance. Those notes closed that distance entirely. I was no longer thinking about how someone might feel. I was feeling it myself. The note said they accepted my apology. I have decided to take that at face value because I don't know what else to do with it. Whatever that person intended by writing those words, I've chosen to read them as a door closing, and I've tried to leave it closed. The third story is the one that has stayed with me in a different way than the other 2. The other 2 I can trace. I can see the line from what I was doing to what happened as a result. The third one has an element to it that I've never been fully able to account for, and that part still sits with me in a way the others don't. This was about 3 years ago. I was working a job that had me out late most nights. Not a formal night shift with a set schedule. More like irregular hours that often stretched until 10 or 11 depending on what the day had looked like. The job involved driving. Different parts of the city, different neighborhoods, a lot of time alone in a car moving from place to place. I had a specific area I was responsible for, and I knew it well. Every shortcut, every cut-through, every dead end, every spot where you could sit for a while without standing out. I had learned it the way I learned every area I spent time in. Methodically and thoroughly. I want to be upfront about something before I continue. I was using the mobility and access that job gave me to do things on the side that had nothing to do with the job. I'm not going to be more specific than that. Just understand that I was regularly in places and at hours that I had plausible cover for being in, and I was taking advantage of that cover. I had done it long enough that the risk felt theoretical rather than real. That's a dangerous place to get to. I know that now. The area I'm going to talk about specifically was on the east side of the city, industrial, the kind of neighborhood that goes quiet fast once the businesses close for the day. Warehouses, a couple of auto body shops, a restaurant that shut down at 8, wide streets with not much on them after dark. I had been going there for months. I knew it well enough that I had started thinking of certain spots as mine in that irrational way I mentioned before. There was a particular side alley off one of the main streets that I used regularly. It was a through route if you knew it was there, but most people didn't, so it stayed empty. Good sight lines in both directions. Easy to see anyone coming before they got close. I had spent a lot of hours in that alley. The night this happened, I was parked there around 9:30. I had been there about 20 minutes and everything was normal. Quiet night, not much moving anywhere. And then a car came into the alley from the far end. That happens sometimes. It was a through route, so occasionally someone would use it. But this car drove slowly toward me and then stopped, about 50 feet back, and sat there with its headlights on. I watched it in my mirrors. Nothing happened. The car just sat there, lights on, engine presumably running. I told myself it was someone who had pulled in to make a phone call or check something on their phone. That happened. I started my engine just to have it running in case I needed to move, thinking I would give it another minute and then pull out if the car didn't move. But before I could put it in drive, the car pulled forward and parked directly behind mine, close enough that I couldn't back out, blocking me in completely. I sat very still for a second. I put my window down and looked back at the car behind me. The headlights were still on, shining into my mirrors, and I couldn't see through the windshield clearly. I waited for someone to get out. Nobody did. The car just sat there with the engine running and the lights on, and nobody getting out. I got out of my car. I know how that sounds. In retrospect, I would have made a different call, but staying in the car felt worse in that moment. Like a trap. I got out and I stood next to my door and I looked at the car behind me and I called out. Asked if everything was all right, the way you would if you thought maybe someone had a problem with their car. The driver's door opened. A woman got out. She was maybe in her mid-40s. She was dressed like someone who works in an office. Neat, professional, nothing out of place. She did not look like someone who was in distress or confused about where she was. She walked toward me and stopped about halfway between her car and mine. And she looked at me and she said very calmly, "I think you know why I'm here." I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. She said, "I think you do." We looked at each other for a moment. She was not aggressive. She was not emotional. She was just completely still and completely certain in a way that I found genuinely unsettling. I asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted me to understand that what I had been doing in this area had been noticed and that it needed to stop. She said it the way you'd say something that is simply true and does not require any particular emphasis. I asked her who she was. She said that didn't matter. I asked her what she was going to do about it. She said, "Nothing." "That's up to you." I asked her what she meant by that and she said, "You can keep doing what you've been doing, or you can stop. But you should know that what you've been doing hasn't gone unnoticed." End quote. And then she said stop again, quietly, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she turned around and walked back to her car and got in. I stood there in that alley next to my car trying to process what had just happened. She had blocked me in, and she was still blocking me in. I got back in my car and I sat there for a minute and then I rolled my window down and told her I needed to get out. She pulled forward, slowly, giving me just barely enough room to maneuver out of there. I did it carefully, slowly, because the last thing I wanted was anything that could be read as aggressive. When I got out onto the main street, I checked my mirror. She had pulled back into the alley and was sitting in that same spot I had been sitting in 20 minutes ago, just sitting there in the dark with her lights off, watching me leave. The drive home was one of the quieter drives I've ever taken. I sat in my driveway for a while before going inside, and I kept trying to reconstruct what had just happened in a way that made full sense to me. How had she known to be in that alley? How long had she been watching before that night? Who was she connected to, and what was she protecting? Why had she done it that way, alone, in the dark, blocking a stranger's car in an empty alley? Why not call someone? Why not do something more official? The composure she had shown was not the composure of someone acting on impulse. That was a prepared person, someone who had thought this through carefully and decided that this specific approach was the right one. I went back to that area exactly one more time. About 2 weeks later, I told myself I was just checking to make sure everything was fine, that nothing had changed, that it was safe to go back to normal. The woman wasn't there, no unfamiliar cars. The alley was quiet. I sat in it for about 10 minutes, and I could not get comfortable. That feeling of being watched was completely present, even though I couldn't identify anyone doing the watching. Every shadow on the edges of the alley felt occupied. I left, and I did not go back. I've turned that woman over in my head for 3 years now. She is the thing from this whole period of my life that I have never been able to fully explain or fully put down. Because everything about the way she handled that situation was more deliberate than anything I had ever done. She had watched longer than I had. She had prepared more carefully. She had waited for exactly the right moment, and then she had made her move in a way that was completely controlled and completely effective and left me with nothing to push back against. She said stop, and I stopped, and she left. I want to know what that kind of certainty feels like from the inside. I have been thinking about that for 3 years, and I still don't have an answer. I've spent most of my adult life being pretty good at reading situations and people, and I had no framework for that woman. She didn't fit into any category I had. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She wasn't performing toughness. She was just absolutely certain that what she was doing was the right thing and that it was going to work, and she was right on both counts. If there's anything I've taken out of the 3 stories I've just told you, it's something I couldn't have articulated when any of them were happening. It's that the people on the other side of whatever you're doing are not variables. They're not just elements of a situation you're managing. They're people who notice things, who pay attention, who think, who plan, and who sometimes decide they've had enough and do something about it in ways you never see coming. I thought I was good at observing people. What I learned is that some people are a lot better at it than I ever was. I'm not who I was back then. I won't tell you I'm someone completely different because I don't think people fully change the way they like to claim they do. But I'm different enough, and a big part of that difference comes down to those 3 moments. The woman in the parking lot with her bags who never knew I was there, the sticky note in my kitchen, and the woman in the alley who looked at me and said stop and meant it all the way through. Some lessons you learn because someone teaches you, and some you learn because the world decides it's time.